Well, thank you again, Sandy. Been a terrific meeting. It's run like clockwork, and I know it doesn't do that all by itself. We all appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special session. It's entitled Whither Art Thou? Communication in Sport. Joining me on this panel are four scholars at different points in their career to take a look at the field and its future. You may have noticed I ushered them into their seats in a certain order. We're going down. You can be like Powerball, guess our ages. By age, I took a stab at it without really knowing, but we're going in that direction, and that's the way we'll hear our comments today. This panel builds on a session at last year's meeting in Charlotte organized by Simon Leiston. Following a keynote address by my friend Michael Reel, Simon asked panelists about the state of the field, singular, or fields, plural, of play in communication and sport. Simon's questions were provocative and timely. And basically, he posed two related but in a way oppositional questions. The first one, is there a field, and if so, what is it? Or, are there many fields of play with offset objectives, priorities, and levels of development? The answers offered by the panelists at that session, and most notably those offered by me in what grew to be an editorial essay that appeared in last September in our journal Communication and Sport, started a conversation that we'd like to continue today. In sum, I wavered on whether communication and sport at this time constitutes a coherent field. Instead, I posed that we're at a moment where there are three relatively strikingly disparate dispositions at play, dispositions that can be complementary, but presently are driven by different goals, priorities, and tactics. As I put it, the cart of unification may be ahead of some quite different horses. In brief, I posed that the three dispositions could be drawn as follows. The media, sports, and society disposition. This grew from rising concerns about how media is played in the social and cultural dynamic in and around sport. In this disposition, there are two houses. The first might be called the media studies, cultural studies side, with focus on inequities of representation, commodification, and political economy. The second side of that house is a more detached, scienticized side, building on the traditions of what used to be called mass communication research and social psychology that aimed to distance processual questions from politicized contexts by engaging tools and theories from the social sciences. Second was a disposition I characterized as the sport communication as profession disposition. In contrast to the first disposition, which was aimed at a real world orientation that takes that real world largely as a given in what might be characterized as a received view, with focus on the pragmatics of practice, strategies, and effectiveness in the sport communication marketplace. Here, too, in the sport communication as profession disposition are two houses. The first is concerned with the professional practice of sports reporting, broadcasting, PR, and advertising as seen often in journalism and broadcasting programs. The second variant is in the professional concern seen as seated in sport management programs, where we see a focus on administrative, managerial, professional, and ultimately marketplace effectiveness. The third disposition is the communication and sport disposition. It's less developed, with the impossible modifier, non-mediated. This personal or human orientation stems from speech acts, speech communication, communication sciences, and organizational communication traditions. So with this background, or perhaps as a target, today we'd like to continue the conversation by seeking answers to two questions about where we are and what needs to happen. We'll take the questions in turn and move through the panelists giving a take on each. The first question is, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses in the present state of affairs in communication and sports scholarship, research, pedagogy, and/or curriculum? And we're going to go by seniority. Andy.
All right. First of all, thanks so much for being here today. I think this is a great discussion to continue, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I think if you look at the three dispositions up here, you're going to find different nuance in what we're going to talk about here. For me, a lot of it becomes, where do those discussions take place? And do they take place in different places, or do they take place together? 14 years ago, 8 of us got together, and at the time we didn't know it was the first summit on communication and sport, but it was, and we're thrilled at how this has grown. However, the main impetus for that was to provide a space, to provide structures in which these discussions could develop, where we could actually develop a discipline and a field. And so I think with this first question, where I think we need to focus is what happens after you have those structures. A couple of our main goals, for instance, one, really back then was just to get a special issue, which Bob Krizak edited, for Western Journal of Communication. We now have a journal. It's an international journal. It's a well-established journal. It's with a good publisher. All right, we've got that structure. We said at the time there were no sport divisions in communication other than IAMCR. Now there's NCA, ICA, AJMC, BEA. So we now have all of those structures. And so there's a couple key questions we have to ask ourselves once those structures are in place. The first one, of course, is what does an outlet like IACS uniquely offer that these other associations do not? How can IACS work through some of these core issues to perhaps fuse some of these three things there? I know some people have said before, like, we didn't need some, an NCA division or something like that. And I think the argument was, for instance, like with the communication studies element that we say is perhaps least developed of the three, you cannot develop that disposition without the National Communication Association. You had to have everyone having those conversations. So the first core question is, what can this organization, how can it pivot to the point where perhaps we're not even functioning as much as a summit, as much as within these structures, how do we grow? But then the second larger question, I think, is, have we created barriers in which the only thing or the only people we need to speak to are sports scholars? We have those three dispositions, but there are so many other elements that we need to include within that discussion. I think it was incredibly useful 15 years ago to be able to explain to a small group and team scholar, why aren't you doing sports? Or a religious scholar, or a interpersonal scholar, or whatever it is. And I don't know now, I mean, for the most part, you can never have to really have those conversations to the point that, have we segmented ourselves out? Are we not making those interconnections anymore? And so part of this discussion has got to be, how do we, now that we've created these structures within there, we can't be this isolated island. We have to interact, and there's two different ways you have to interact. That's with other communication subdisciplines, and it's with subdisciplines beyond communication that have those relevance. Management, sociology, history, whatever those elements are, we need to, we're at the point now where we have the structures. Now what do you do with it?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. It's an honor to be up here, and I appreciate you organizing this, Dr. Winter. I'm going to speak about pedagogy, specifically where courses and programs are and where they could go and where the trends are. And a lot of this is going to come from, I wrote the first chapter for the upcoming book, Strategic Sport Communication, in which I had to research where programs and courses are at. And it's been a big change, and also a lot of what you see out there isn't reality. You know, websites saying, hey, we offer a program in this, then you do more research on it, and you say, this isn't a program. In fact, it's a website, and maybe you have a course or two. And I'm guessing most people in here teach something in sport media, but we're all over the place as far as where we teach that. And I've sort of tried to, Dr. Winter was pretty much the only one of the only people I know that jumped around, where he jumped around from media into sport management and back. And Galen and I have done that more recently. And so my background was I've taught in sport management, sport leadership, sport studies, and now journalism, mass comm, where my undergraduate degrees were at in background. And all of these areas have programs. And so what we're looking at, where the programs are at, the field can't really grow until we have more actual degrees, more majors, more cognates, et cetera. And they are coming, but slower than people predicted. And Andy just mentioned talking about the communication studies in sport disposition. Where are the programs for there? There's courses being offered all over the place. There are faculty doing research in media studies, communication studies, but there really aren't programs. And one of the problems with that is, for any of you, how many of you have designed a program where you actually had to go through all the paperwork, the political terrain of it? It's no fun. And at state universities right now, the first thing they ask is, where are the jobs for this program? And the two up here of his dispositions, he put them both under sport communications as a profession, are in sport management and in journalism. Okay, and as far as that goes, because they are seen as more practitioner, even though the coursework in sport management is mostly straight out of a book. All right, the idea of it is it's practitioner field, and because of that, that is where the growth is at. So just to give you a sample of it, these, using a liberal definition of what is a program, okay, these are the sport management programs. Some of the examples that are offering an undergraduate major or distinct track in sport communication or related topic, you know, journalism, media, include Drexel, Elizabeth City State, Indiana, we'll get to that, Ithaca, Mississippi State, NYU, North Alabama, Winston-Salem State. However, if you go to the journalism mass comm area, Alabama, Arizona State, Ashland, Clemson, Columbia College in Chicago, Ferris State, LaSalle College, Missouri, Morehouse, Oklahoma State, Penn State, Quinnipiac, Springfield, Syracuse. These are just some examples, all right? And some of those aren't really full programs. And of course, Bradley is the first standalone school in this area. The trend has been moving towards journalism, which was always the natural home for it, but in both in the field and in academia, it was viewed as a toy department. I went to school at Georgia. We had half the students in the building wanted to do sports journalism. We didn't offer a single course in that area, all right? It's only been in the last decade or so where schools have started offering courses in that area and now programs. And they're generally, I remember Andy speaking about it 2 years ago, they're generally at schools that seem to be favorable to big athletic departments. You know, Penn State, Oklahoma State, Alabama, et cetera. They're not at Berkeley. They're not at Columbia, okay? Missouri says they have it. It's snake oil, all right? They have 0 faculty that are dedicated to that area in their famed journalism school, all right? So these are examples of where the trend is, and I think that will affect, because if they are going to start building it more in journalism schools, you're going to see more research on the profession and less maybe on the sport and society disposition, which, you know, is not as emphasized there. And in sport management, that research, sport media is a peripheral area, and it's usually taught by a doc student or a lecturer, or it's a secondary course for somebody whose primary research is in sport marketing, consumer behavior, et cetera. And so that's also going to affect it. And the biggest problems is that the best historic research in this area has come out of sports sociology, communication studies, et cetera. But at least from my research, I could not find in the research university any actual degrees in that area. I saw some courses, I see a lot of scholars, and they usually teach a course or two in that realm, but there aren't any programs. And I don't know, and it would be wonderful, because the ideal thing is to have programs built in all of these areas, all right, to fill needs at various universities. But until there is growth in those areas, I think that's going to, sidetrack the field from growing until until all these areas start offering more programs, more tracks, et cetera. And you hear a lot of administrators talk about it, but you don't see a lot of schools following through. As I said, that's a pretty small number of schools offering that, and a lot of those are 2 or 3 courses in a degree where it's filled out by other courses, particularly on the journalism and sport management side. So that's sort of where we're at right now. It's growing, but at a slow pace.
All right. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it from a research perspective, and I also wanted to say thank you to Larry and to Sandra for putting this panel together. In terms of the first question and talking about sort of strengths and weaknesses, I think from a research perspective with our strengths, I think that it's fantastic that we have a conference like this that allows us to be able to come together and disseminate research. It's great to kind of hear from Andy and talking about sort of the history. This is my 5th conference here, and so I wasn't sort of here from the very beginning, but I know that I do feel like when I come to a conference like this, that I feel like I'm at home, because it gives me an opportunity really to talk to other people who are out here in the field who are doing the kind of research that I'm doing. I feel somewhat isolated inside of our sport administration program, and that like I'm the only one there that really does sport communication research, so it's nice to be able to come here and kind of have that shared language and conversation. I think another strength that we have here is that we're willing to engage in conversations like this. So this idea that we can be introspective and think not only about sort of the things that we're doing really well, but what are some of our weaknesses, or where do we have opportunities to be able to grow. And so I appreciate being a part of this conversation. And then I also think in terms of our journals. So we had our editorial board meeting last night and talking about communication in sport, and the fact that we've got so many good articles that are coming out, a lot of good research that's being done. I do obviously a lot of sport or social media research, and so I feel like that we've done a good job in terms of really being out there on the forefront with that area of research and really trying to address some of the problems that are out there, address some of the different issues that are out there in the industry, and doing research around that. On the weaknesses side, I'm kind of talking about social media research more specifically. I'm also a reviewer, and so I know that there's some opportunities for us to improve in this area. I think that especially with our social media research right now, we're definitely mired in content analysis.